President Biden spent the first day of his Middle East trip in Israel. White House officials say he will meet with Israeli, Palestinian, and Saudi Arabian leaders in an effort to renew talks over a nuclear deal with Iran. Ed O'Keefe is traveling with the president.
President Biden arrived in Israel today with the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran hanging over his first presidential trip to the Middle East.
Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon.
The president, who was shown one of the Iron Dome missile launchers, told Israeli television he wants to revive the stalled talks over ending Iran's nuclear program, a deal originally brokered by Barack Obama and severed by Donald Trump.
I think it was a gigantic mistake for the last president to get out of the deal. They're closer to a nuclear weapon now than they were before.
That puts him at odds with Israeli officials who've long opposed the talks.
Israel's purpose is first to stop Iran from reaching the nuclear bomb, and second, to stop Iran from entrenchment around the borders of Israel.
One notable item President Biden acknowledged isn't on the agenda here. Peace talks between the Israelis and Palestinians stalled since 2014. And on the streets of Jerusalem, people know the visit is about much more than Israel.
I think the most important issue to come to the Middle East, I think it's Iran. Let's be honest.
Administration officials are also increasingly concerned with Iran's growing ties to Russia. President Vladimir Putin will visit Tehran next week as the Iranians are planning to provide armed drones to the Russians for the war in Ukraine.
And Ed O'Keefe joins me now from Jerusalem. Ed, in an interview with Israeli television Tuesday, President Biden said, and I'm quoting from him now, the only thing worse than the Iran that exists now is an Iran with nuclear weapons. And if we can return to the deal, we can hold them tight. Okay, but what does it mean to return to the deal? What is the shape of the deal right now, Ed? What's in it and what's out of it?
The shape of it is kind of non-formed in that the talks have stalled. There had been hopes that something would materialize by this past March. It hasn't happened. And by reiterating his desire to see those talks continue, he's signaling that he wants the Europeans, the Chinese, and others who've been involved in these conversations to get back to the bargaining table and somehow figure out how to stop Iran from doing what it has already started to do, which is enrich uranium and get to a point, many believe, of no return. Here in Israel, this is, of course, a top issue of concern for obvious reasons. They're furious with the Biden administration for continuing or even talking about trying to continue these talks. Instead, looking forward to tomorrow when the president's set to sign what they're calling the Jerusalem Declaration, or an agreement between the U.S. and Israel to use all of their possible powers. It's a rough quotation of what they're going to say tomorrow, to stop Iran from doing this. The Israelis would much rather just work with us on trying to stop Iran rather than getting the rest of the world involved in something that they don't think necessarily will hold together. One Israeli official that you saw in our report there, former intelligence chief, said, part of the concern for countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, is our own domestic politics. Will Joe Biden or a Democrat be around after 2024 to keep those kinds of agreements, like the Iranian nuclear deal, if one were to come together, in place? Or is Donald Trump coming back just to rip it up again? And so there's great concern and skepticism in this part of the world about what the president is pushing for, with concern that he may not be around to see things through after the end of his current term.
Diplomacy as punditry. Let me ask you, Ed, about the former President Trump. He was quite popular in Israel, in part because he was no fan of that nuclear deal with Iran. So how scratchy is the reception that Joe Biden is receiving?
Well, this is someone who's been to this country 10 times, mostly as a senator. He talked today again about the fact that he met Golda Meir back in the early 1970s, shortly after, around the same time President Nixon became the first president to come here, and has met with every Israeli prime minister since. He is somebody who Israeli leadership knows is somebody who understands the region. They're proud of the fact that he is an explicit Zionist, or believes fully in the establishment of and the continuation of Israel. I noticed, though, however, John, walking through the old city, and this is just anecdotal, but shows you we've been here a few days, they're selling kippahs with Donald Trump on them. I have yet to spot a kippah with Joe Biden on it. And so that may give you a sense of not only who's buying in the old city, but what Israelis think of the former president and the fact that he was such a devout and steadfast supporter of this country and visited a few times. So we'll see after this trip how they really feel about him. But for now, at least, there's maybe not as much emotional support on the streets as there was for the last guy.
President Biden was asked in that interview about some Democrats, members of his party, who've maintained that Israel has an apartheid system over the Palestinians. And President Biden said, there are a few of them. I think they're wrong. He's referring there to members of his own party. I think they're making a mistake. Israel is a democracy. Israel is our ally. And Israel is a friend. And I think I make no apologies. So clearly doing what he can there to try to repair those relations you were talking about.
Yeah, and look, this is a country that pays very close attention to U.S. domestic politics, especially what is said about Israel or about the Middle East peace process. And so Channel 12, to its credit, the Israeli channel here that got this interview, went for it and asked him about it. And as you saw there, he put distance between himself and those more liberal members of his party who have raised questions about the Israeli government's treatment of the Palestinian people, who accuse it of carrying out an apartheid against them, saying that it's a small minority of his party, also pointing out that among Democrats and Republicans, there is strong support for Israel and its existence. But another example of him perhaps trying to put a little distance between himself and the left wing of his party, as he's doing on other matters back home right now.
Speaking of distance, the president is supposed to meet with the Saudi king and the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. President Biden is leading a coalition based on Western values in Ukraine against Russia, arguing that the values of the West must be defended. Okay. Now in Saudi Arabia, those values inspired candidate Biden to say Saudi Arabia was a pariah because Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been fingered by the CIA as giving the order to kill Washington Post reporter Jamal Khashoggi. So how does a president who's standing up for Western values on one part of the world face that issue that he's meeting with someone who's been accused of basically ordering an assassination? How does he work all that out with this meeting?
He holds his nose, he swallows hard, and he just does it. And he acknowledges that it's something he just has to do because Saudi Arabia is so critical to geopolitics, to the economy of the world, to the ongoing concern about oil supply and oil prices, not only in the United States, but around the world. He's also, of course, trying to hold Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others in this region together against Iran. That is the broader mission of this trip, is to try to warn and isolate that country as it continues to harbor nuclear ambitions. Saudi Arabia, a big rival of Iran, so he sees the benefit of talking to them about that and trying to cut a deal there. What we're going to watch for especially, John, do we see the president alongside the crown prince? Does the crown prince get to shake his hand or grip and grin with him, smile in a photo or an image that is seen not only here in the Arab world and in the Middle East, but around the world, and perhaps restores the legitimacy MBS has been craving ever since the Khashoggi incident and the CIA saying he was responsible for leading to his murder? But this is one of those instances where this president is going against a campaign pledge, perhaps being reminded that, what's the old adage, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. You also have to govern in reality, and the reality is right now, given the state of the world, given the state of the economy and how Americans feel about it, he's got to come to an oil-producing nation and perhaps suggest to them it's time to pump more oil and figure out a way to work together.
Ed O'Keefe, really appreciate it, Ed. Thanks so much.
Take care.